Mr. President, up here! I voted for you! Wait a minute. That guy on the grassy knoll's got a gun. He's gonna shoot the president. Holy smokes, I've got to do something. All right, Lee. Time to become an American hero.
Darkmyths.org and Neopolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. Sorry it's taking me a little while. I haven't been feeling too hot lately. Probably still sound like crap, but I'm getting better. Look, this week I got a great show for you. Stu Wexlar is on the show, and I've also been trying to clean up this audio a little bit. I mean, it sounds okay, don't get me wrong, and there's just a slight echo on Stu's end at times, not the whole interview. It does start off with a little echo, but it clears up. Normally I would probably do an interview over if it sounds like this, but this information contained within this podcast is quite frankly needs to be heard. And I don't think we can catch lightning in a bottle twice as far as what we covered in this show. So I'm releasing it as is. This whole thing is a learning thing. I got this new way I'm recording the show, and it's totally my fault. I probably should have told Stu to put in headphones, which cut down on the echo. But like I said, it's a learning thing, and I will learn next time. I promise. But anyway, this show is brought to you by covertbookreport.com this week. Make sure you head over there and check it out. There's always a link over at tlgpodcast.com if you can't remember it. It's chock full of informative and well-researched articles for you to check out, and I highly recommend it. That's covertbookreport.com. Let's see, what else? Not much else except happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Kwanzaa, all that good stuff. It's coming up. And probably won't have a show out before then. So it'll be after the holidays when I talk to you again. But anyway, enjoy the show, people. Like I said, this is Stu Wexlar, and you're not going to want to miss this one. Trust me.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode number 134 of the Lone Gunman Podcast, and I'm your host, Rob Clark. And today, a special treat for everyone. I have the co-chairman of Lancer. I also have the author of America's Secret Jihad, The Awful Grace of God, Religious Terrorism, White Supremacy, and the Unsolved Murder of Martin Luther King, and Shadow Warfare. Stu Wexlar joins me. How you doing, Stu?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great, buddy. I'm doing great. Finally get to talk to you. I've been wanting to for a long time, my friend.
Yeah, and I'm active listener to your show, so I've been looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, we've been kind of talking behind the scenes for many, many months now about a variety of topics. I know the right wing is an interest of yours, of course.
Big time, and you had some fascinating shows and managed to hook me up with some very interesting people.
Yeah, I mean, after looking at General Walker for a while, and it kind of opened up into the John Birch Society and the Minutemen and what all these guys were doing, and not just with JFK either. A lot with MLK, it kind of seeps over, and you see kind of the same characters popping up.
Yeah, it's definitely names that were familiar in both, that crossed over in both the MLK research and the JFK research.
Oh, for sure. So, tell me a little bit. How was Lancer this year?
Lancer was great. Very fluid. Several very interesting presentations. I think it's almost a little bit of the calm before the storm, because I think next year is going to be one of the more monumental years in Kennedy assassination research for a lot of reasons, not just the potential release of files in October.
So you think we're going to be getting some big revelations coming?
I'm very hopeful. I think, from what I understand, 3 or 4 people are coming out with books, and all of them, to the extent that I know anything about them, and I only know very little about them, but the very little I know suggests that they could be really groundbreaking.
Well, that's good. That's good, because it's been a while since, we've had a groundbreaking book, or any research, on the Kennedy assassination. It's, it comes in sporadic spurts, but, some of it's not always on the pro finding out things side of things. It's more of debunking certain myths that we kind of associate with the case.
Right, and I think that's also an incredibly valuable thing. I think this year, though, that's coming up, and I kind of like you, I generally think that books fall into 3 categories. They either clean out, sweep away some of the dust that we need to sweep away. They synthesize information that already exists and maybe add a little bit of new. Or they break new ground. We haven't had a break new ground book in a while, and I think we're going to maybe get as many as 3 next year, and that's before the files get released.
Yeah, the last one I can think of that really, really caught my attention was last year when that General Walker and the Murder of President Kennedy came out. I thought that was a really, really good book, and a lot of new stuff in it.
I haven't given the book as much time as I should, but I've given it some time, and I'll be honest with you, I think it has more to offer for me on the King front, as oddly as, even though it really doesn't focus on that at all, than it does on the Kennedy front. I do think Caulfield does have some very interesting arguments that, from what I can see, but I do think it falls short. Maybe we could talk about that later in one particular area. And I'm not opposed, and my co-author on Awful Grace of God, Larry, and I, we've talked about this more than once, to the idea that there was a right-wing conspiracy that eventually that attempted or thought about going after John Kennedy. We just don't think it's the one that actually materialized.
Yeah, that's one thing when you look at this case and you try to really grasp a credible threat to the president's life. The one thing that keeps coming up over and over is that he's soft on communism, and guys like General Walker and the extreme right wing, did pose a credible threat. There were threats investigated against him from these guys. You can't discount what Miltier said. And a ton of other things. And then when you look at Oswald and you see this poor guy with no motive, it's kind of makes you scratch your head.
Right. It's the odd situation with the Kennedy assassination, I guess, is on the one hand, you almost are inundated with the sheer number of groups of people who had serious problems with the president. And it's so many of them that it's hard to make sense of anything, mutually exclusive groups. And at the same time, you have all these people with these motives, and then you have the accused assassin who, according to all the counts that we have, was at worst indifferent and at best fond of the president, and trying to make sense of why, that dichotomy is part of, I think, what makes the case baffling to a lot of people.
Yeah, because you look at the CIA, and of course it could have been rogue elements in the CIA, and you can see why they would have wanted him taken out, just for self-preservation reasons, because Kennedy wasn't really too fond of how the CIA was conducting its business. And, I think that secret society speech was aimed at their general direction.
Yeah. Oh, I could probably sit here and list 12 groups. And again, some of them are mutually exclusive. I mean, within the research community, it's almost, people only say it in hushed tones, but, Castro had a motive. The Secret Service, potentially, although, I wouldn't put them on the top of my list. Mafia had motive. Rogue KGB had motive. Rogue CIA had motive.
Yeah.
Alan
Joint
Dulles had
Chiefs.
motive. I mean, you could go through almost every group and somebody had a motive. It's almost why going the who had the motive route is possibly the worst route to go, I would think.
Yeah, no doubt. And, then you got to look at who would actually have the balls to actually, try to pull this off. Because,
And, at the ultimate end of the day, somebody could have less of a quote unquote, if you want to call it that, motive as somebody else, but that doesn't mean they didn't do it. Someone could hate somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 on a 7, and another one could hate somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 on a 10. It doesn't mean that the 7 didn't do it and the 10 did. So ultimately, you need to find, evidence, and I think, and it actually gets to where I started my presentation at Lancer. It's a harder row to hoe, but I think you have to work up from either Oswald or Ruby or both, and try and find a group that had a motive. Unless you've got something that's so solid on the top-down front that it's hard to argue that it's almost, implies inevitably what happened in Dallas. I think you have to take the tougher row, and you have to move your way up from the bottom up.
Yeah, no doubt. And of course, when you're looking at Oswald, he's associated with, a lot of the elements that we're talking about here. The extreme right, the Russians, the CIA,
Cubans, anti-Castro, FBI. He can go in a lot of potential directions too, which I think even makes it harder, because I think what you have to do is try, and I think it's the great sort of gap in where researchers have gone. You really have to get to October and November.
Yeah.
And I think we've done a fascinating job of getting through the end of September. And we fall short on October and November.
Right. I mean, either way you slice it, even when you go back a little earlier to the summer of '63 and you see what was going on there in New Orleans, either Oswald was a seriously, embedded Marxist and Castro lover and trying to do this, or, he was put up to acting like he was,
Right. And then who would have done the putting up? Because you could get that from anti-Castro people. You could get that
Bannister.
from right-wing people. And I thought the one big thing that I think Caulfield really did was place Bannister in an even more firmer right-wing context than he already was. It could be pro-Castro folks. There's all these double agents that are running around in the anti-Castro community. And, and then, to be fair, you could have some kind of weird lone gunman thing, I guess, coming from it also. And that's why I say, you've got to get it closer to the day of, because until you can get it close to the day of, even Oswald takes you in 5 or 6 different directions.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that was part of Carmine's focus was maybe the last 72 hours, of I think he even narrowed it down further than that as to, how much time Oswald would have had to actually plan on doing this if he did it.
Right. And I think that, Carmine was great seeing him at the conference. I think a big part of, the last 72 hours is a big part of it. The way I couched it at Lancer is this. You could believe Oswald was a lone gunman. You could believe Oswald was a shooter in a conspiracy. You could believe he was a complete dupe. You still need to find out in the complete dupe scenario, unless you think these folks are going to take a risk on framing somebody who they have absolutely no control over on the day of the assassination, which is a huge risk when you think about it. He could have been outside in front of 1,000 cameras. He could have been eating lunch, and everyone could have actually vouched for his alibi. So you have to assume the most likely assumption is someone had the ability to get him to be where he was on November 22nd and somehow influence or control his movements. And unless you know who that is, you're going to have a problem. And, in fairness to, even folks like Posner, his argument has always been, show me the person who manipulated Oswald. My response would be, I don't think people have seriously looked. At least in the 2 weeks of. If you really want to nail it down, I think you got to get into those 1 to 2 weeks leading up to the assassination. Really, the month to 2 months, last 2 weeks, last 72 hours, last 24 hours.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, one thing that I kind of gleaned from Caulfield's book was, I was always looking for some kind of a connection between, of course, after Jack Ruby was arrested and he was in front of the Warren Commission, he begged them, hey, get me out of Dallas because I am scared to death of the John Birch Society and General Walker. And of course, we know he was going around taking pictures of these, extreme right billboards, the morning after the assassination. But, there was always that link missing between Ruby and just about anybody else in Dallas. And, he had in his book, the testimony of William Duff, who actually put Ruby meeting with General Walker at his house, in early 62, late 62, early 63, I'm sorry, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Right. Well, Ruby, though, also gets a little bit tricky, too, because he connects to underworld figures. He connects to Dallas cops. He connects to, gun running. And to be honest with you, more so than the Oswald situation, Ruby confuses me as much as anybody. I lean against it, but I could believe that he even was a vigilante, more so than I could believe Oswald went alone at this thing. But it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, I think he was definitely dirtier than just a hapless barkeep there in Dallas who wanted to take revenge for Jackie Kennedy so she wouldn't have to come back to the trial.
Yeah, I lean against it. But I'm more open to it when you hear some of the people who knew Ruby and how tempestuous he was. I'm a little bit more open to that than I am. It's still not fully, and I'm more inclined to think it was part of a conspiracy. But I'm more inclined towards that than towards Oswald's being by himself, lone gunman.
Yeah. One figure.
I lean towards both.
Yeah. Well, one figure that always intrigued me, when talking about Ruby, is this guy, Larry Crayford, who kind of appears out of nowhere. And about the same time, Oswald gets his job at the school book depository. And, it turns out he was actually in the army in Germany under General Walker in like the early 60s, which is odd.
That's certainly suspicious. But then, we also have with Ruby the Thomas Eli Davis connection.
Yeah.
We have connections to Gordon McClendon. We have connections to Joseph Savello, to various people on the Dallas police. He's a government informant at one point. And a potential criminal informant. So he becomes, again, it's one of these things that leads you in multiple different directions, which is why it becomes more important to nail down those last couple of weeks, last 72 hours, last 24 hours.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit more about Oswald and what you presented on him at Lancer with his library card and all that. Because, I mean, just from looking at the list of the books that he had checked out of the library there in '63 and was reading, it's a quite an extensive list and of course very varied in from science fiction to biographies. It seems to me like this guy wouldn't have a lot of free time.
Right. Well, there's that. I focused on something else with this library card, less so than his reading habits, which I do find fascinating. I focused does the card itself point us in any directions as to who might have had the ability to influence Lee Harvey Oswald again in those 24 to 72 hours. And other people have explored it and found similar things. I found 2 or 3 additional things. And it's one of these situations where this is either a series of really weird rabbit holes. It could be 1 or 2 rabbit holes and one really legitimate lead, or it's something that really is pregnant with conspiratorial possibilities. And I don't know where to stand on it. And I'll share it with your audience, and I'll let them draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, because it's even off my radar. I haven't really looked into it at all either.
So you can go with the way I put it is there's 3 major directions that the card takes you. They all tend to link up at a place called Moore Chevrolet in Dallas that has had very little attention paid to it. Some of the other elements of this story have had attention paid to it, but just maybe not as extensively as they could have. So I'll quickly list the 3 ways it goes. The one really interesting lead comes from the very person whose name is on the card as a reference. The second really interesting lead has to do with someone who worked at the building where this person who's the reference, his library card was, which is Moore Chevrolet. And then the third has to do with something called the Texas Import-Export Company and a guy named Alexander Kleinlehrer. All of them link up to the library card and are in 1 or 2 steps removed from the person whose name is at the bottom of the card as a reference, named Jack Bowen or Jack Leslie Bowen. He worked with Oswald at Jaggers Charles Stovall, and this is really the first area of interest, and it's the one that's been the most explored. So Oswald uses the name Jack L. Bowen on who lives in Oak Cliff, which is also interesting, on his library card as a reference. And so it's found in Oswald's belongings on the day of the assassination, in his wallet, although that's a whole other story. And the FBI decides to run down who this person is. Is he an associate of Oswald? Who is he? And what they find is they find a Jack L. Bowen in New York, and he says he knew and worked with Oswald at Jaggers Giles Stovall. For the audience, that's the film defense contractor company that Oswald works in early part of 63, late 62. And so Oswald's working there, and according to Bowen, they have a conversation. Oswald expressed an interest in getting a library card, and Bowen says to him, well, my girlfriend's a secretary at the Dallas Public Library. Use my name. So a couple of things come out of this. The first is that Jack L. Bowen isn't really Jack L. Bowen. Jack L. Bowen is really a guy by the name of Grossi. John Caesar Grossi. And John Caesar Grossi has been living under an alias. And that's because he's a career criminal. And so the guy who Oswald, so just so the audience gets back to this, it's going to be a little bit difficult to follow. The guy that Oswald has on a reference for getting his library card is a guy who is actually a career criminal who really did work with Oswald at Jaggers, but did so under an assumed name. And so one other thing that emerges out of this that doesn't even get commented on by the FBI is that it's actually false that his girlfriend worked at the public library. It's difficult to work too much with his false statements because what he appears to be is a con man. Somebody who develops relationships, say, with business people and with owners and tries to fleece them for money. That's one of the things Bowen does, or Grossi. The other thing is he appears to be involved. The thing he was on the run from was a bank robbery charge. So it doesn't stop there either, because if you look more deeply into Grossi, what you'll find is by no later than 1970, he's citing some very interesting people as having close relationships with him or a relationship with him. The two he names are Joseph Bonanno, and a guy named Pete Licavoli. Bonanno and Licavoli are two big-time mobsters. They're not small-time. Licavoli works out of the Midwest, out of the Cleveland and Detroit area. And Bonanno is, at that time, working out of the Southwest. And they're big-time mobsters.
Yeah, I've heard of them before, for sure.
And Grossi even says that, at least in 1970, he has stayed at Grace Ranch in Arizona, which is Licavoli's ranch, but Licavoli's a very close relationship with Bonanno, who controls the territory. Now, if you know your Kennedy assassination lore, these aren't the two most common names, but they're two very interesting figures. Licavoli has been connected in a recent book directly with an assassination attempt. He was connected by a guy who might be familiar with JFK assassination, which is at least Chauncey Holt connects Grace Ranch directly with the Kennedy assassination. Now, I'm not the biggest believer in Chauncey Holt's story, but he falls into that category of people. Holt claimed in the 90s that he was the guy who delivered the fake Secret Service ID to fake Secret Service agents on the grassy knoll.
Yeah.
And he actually came from Grace Ranch. People have claimed that he looks remarkably like one of the tramps, but I believe the tramps have been identified and they're real tramps.
Right.
That's one of the problems with Holt's story. But his story is unique enough that I believe he's one of these people who has peripheral knowledge, maybe, and connects to the assassination. But a completely independent book published by, of all people, Sam Giancana's neurologist, he uncovered documents where Licavoli is implicated in the assassination. Bonanno's son more or less implicates Bonanno in his book, but I don't know how much I buy into that, or at least that his father had knowledge.
Right.
And Bonanno, what I did not know is Bonanno was very intimately involved with Castro assassination attempts. He apparently had some kind of private line to Richard Bissell and the CIA. And so the involvement of those two people together, Licavoli is very closely connected with the Cleveland mob. That connects. He's very closely connected with what's his name out of Nevada? Name suddenly slips my mind. But he's very close with Cleveland mob. One of the Cleveland mobsters works out of Vegas. And if you remember the Paulino Sierra, Homer Echeverria story, remember that there was a Cleveland connection, and the guy says that as soon as – this is pre-assassination. One of these guys who's a gun runner says as soon as the Kennedy situation is cleared up, I've got people, Jews from Cleveland. Well, that's actually where this might link up. But you do have now documents, supposedly, if you believe Giancana's former neurologist, that link Licavoli up to the assassination. So you got Licavoli and Bonanno are very interesting figures, and Grossi, Bowen, the person who's the reference on Oswald's library card, links up to them. which is incredibly interesting.
Yeah,
That's
no
just
doubt.
one lead. The second lead goes to what Bowen says. He tells the FBI actually asks him for where his library card is, and he says, "Well, I left it with my friend, guy named Edward Riddell." And so the FBI goes looking for Riddell and Bowen's library card, and Riddell works at Moore Chevrolet in Dallas. Now, Riddell takes you in two directions. One is going to be the third thing I thought about. The other one, the third thing I'm going to talk about, but the other one is the second thing I'm going to talk about, which is Moore Chevrolet becomes very interesting because if you dig in, you'll find out that there was another car salesman. Now, we know he worked there in 1962. We know he did not work there in 1964. I'm still trying to find out if he worked there in the relevant time periods during 1963. Now, first thing, by the way, that should occur to you was pointed out by Larry Hancock, is what is a career con man with serious mob connections doing with a library card to begin with?
Right.
And what is he doing loaning it to some random friend in Dallas? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'll speculate maybe at the end with you about it. But
Okay.
the other person who works at Moore Chevrolet, who we don't know if he worked there in 63, what we're trying to find out, is a guy named Charles Waters. And Charles Waters becomes incredibly interesting because he appears to either people were trying to set him up as, or he was actually involved in two different Oswald impersonations, and they're two of the oddest ones in the entire assassination lore because they occur when Oswald's in Russia. And one of them your listeners may be familiar with. It's what we call the Bolton Ford incident.
Right, yeah.
And this is an incident, and I believe it's in Caulfield's book, where and it's in many other books, where right before the Bay of Pigs, a couple of men show up at a auto dealership, ostensibly to get Jeeps. And they're from one of these anti-Castro groups. It's like Free Cuba Committee.
Right.
And one of them identifies himself as Joseph Moore, and Joseph Moore is a very interesting figure. If you follow Garrison and other people like Larry Hancock, somebody fitting the description of Joseph Moore, a bull-necked, stocky Mexican, shows up with Oswald all over the place. So some people speculate that whoever this person is, if it's the same person because it's the same description, that this person is some kind of shepherd for Oswald. The other person who shows up, a blonde person about 5'8", insists on using the name Lee Oswald as the name to buy these Jeeps and trucks. Problem again is this is pre-Bay of Pigs. Oswald's in Russia. Now, I don't find this to be as bizarre as some people do, because it turns out that if you look at the people who run the group, Bannister's in the group, but there's another person who's in the group, I think his last name was Tuhagwe, who actually at one time employed Oswald when Oswald was a teenager in New Orleans. So I could even imagine a completely Samad by Nine instance where this guy reads about Oswald defecting to Russia, becomes super upset with what he sees as some kind of betrayal. He gave this knuckleheaded kid a job or whatever, and then says, you know what, we're going to use this guy's name almost like a joke when we are doing our anti-Castro stuff.
This is the guy that Armstrong, I think Armstrong refers to him as Two Jacks. it was an employer of Oswald when he was a teenager in New Orleans, right?
Correct.
The two Jags or something like that, yeah.
And he then, the situation is that, I mean, this is one of the more well-established stories. Both employees, they had the receipt. And the group involved is a group run by a guy named William Dalzell. And people miss this, but if you go to Dalzell's grand jury testimony to Garrison, you'll see that the Garrison folks ask him about this incident. And it's not too hard to read between the lines. It's pretty darn clear that Dalzell is all but saying Charles Waters is the guy who impersonated Oswald. He gives a description of Charles Waters, and Charles Waters fits the description of the Oswald who went to the group. He explains that Charles Dalzell was an active member of the group, and he says that Charles Waters, I'm sorry. He says that Charles Waters not only fits a description, Charles Waters was the only person who had permission to make purchases of this kind for the group.
Right.
Now, again, this is probably confusing your readers, so I'll just remind them one more time. When they go to find Jack Bowen's library card, because they found him as a reference on Oswald's library card, they go to Moore Chevrolet. Well, it's at least a very distinct possibility that somebody working at that Chevrolet dealership, Charles Waters, was involved in an Oswald impersonation. And here's the crazy part. It wasn't the only one. There's a completely independent story from a guy. Hold on a second. I'm just trying to remember his name. Ray Carney is a radio disc jockey, I guess you would call it, out of Texas. And in 1961, and this is important, this is before Kennedy's assassination, there's actually a 61 report about this. He describes being approached by Charles Waters and a series of other people and a series of additional encounters after the Bay of Pigs to find pilots and other people to be involved in an anti-Castro operation. And then oddly, in 1963, recontacts the Dallas police to tell them that part of this find me pilots scenario included somebody who pretended to be Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, so that puts Charles Waters right in the middle of another potential Oswald impersonation. Right? So to remind your audience one more time, the guy who's working at the auto dealership where they find Jack Bowen's library card and the person who he lent it to, there's another guy working there, Charles Waters, who was involved in possibly as many as 2 Oswald impersonations while Oswald was in Russia. So digest that for a second.
Well,
and then let me add one more thing to the pot that makes it even more suspicious. Some of the audience might remember that they found the map amongst Oswald's belongings, a map of Dallas with markings on it.
Right.
And initially they tried to pass it off as it was like markings that had to do with killing Kennedy. And then it became, the storyline was that it was markings that had to do with Oswald looking for a job. Well, the FBI, there was about 13 markings. The FBI ran down all 13. One of the markings on Oswald's map was for Moore Chevrolet. So you add it all up, you got this weird guy with a criminal background and some pretty serious connections having oddly gotten his name onto Oswald's library card as a reference. If Oswald were just hypothetically going to meet up with somebody in, hypothetically, Moore Chevrolet, and he took out his library card. Well, there was somebody there who could have taken out the Bowen's library card, and suddenly it's like the $50 bill matchup. You've got a connection. Now, just hypothetically, if Oswald was somebody who, happened to run around talking about how he wanted to do something for the anti-Castro cause, if you remember, he made that was something that was a pattern that was common in Oswald's life. And if he had happened to have said that at Jaggers to a guy like Bowen, well, the other thing that Charles Waters was doing, Charles Waters, and was open about this, Charles Waters was actively raising weapons and finding places to train anti-Castro people to go after Castro. So, this is just a hypothetical situation for the people in your audience. I am Oswald. I run around bragging about how I'm Mr. Big Shot mercenary dude who could go after Castro. I do it in front of somebody who happens to have connections in the Bowen, really his real name is Grossi, in the anti-Castro world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, this is again complete speculation, maybe Bowen says, I'll tell you what, I want you to put my name down as a reference on a library card. I will give my library card to a friend of mine who works at a place called Moore Chevrolet. If you show up with your library card, you'll know who to talk to because he will have mine. Same exact address, same exact name. He will in turn put you in touch with someone in the Dallas area who is very active in get Castro plots. That somebody would be, in this hypothetical scenario, Charles Waters. Now, the fact that there's this double thing, I don't know what to make of it. And then there is a third element. When you hear, when they go and talk to the friend who worked at Moore Chevrolet, when they go to talk to Riddell, who had Bowen's library card, Grossi's library card, but that guy, by the way, worked at Jaggers also.
Oh, really?
Riddell. Yeah. And he claims he didn't really have any interaction with Oswald. He doesn't remember Grossi having any interaction with Oswald. The only thing he adds to the mix is that he and Grossi left Dallas in August of 1963. Comes back later on, but leaves in August of 1963. And that timing is interesting to me also. He leaves Jaggers. What he says is that he and Grossi, Riddell and Grossi, the guy at Moore Chevrolet, they were going to try and form a Texas import-export company that would do business out of Mexico. Now, this is where things get down to the nitty-gritty of how FBI records its information. They describe this as in their report as a Texas import company. They take, but for whatever reason, the follow-up investigation, whether they either miswrote it on the report from Riddell, the guy from Moore, or whether or not they misinterpreted it after the fact, they write it down as the Texas import-export company later on when they investigate. So they're very interested in the Texas import-export company. Now, again, Riddell, if he really said a Texas import-export company, it was just may have been just a wild goose chase. But if he in fact said we were going to call it the Texas import-export company, we've got another interesting coincidence on our hands. And that's because Lee Harvey Oswald, amongst his belongings in his home, was an address, a P.O. box for the Texas Import-Export Company. But it gets more interesting because the FBI looked into that company and they found out that it was not a real company. It was a company that was used by a guy named Alexander Kleinlehrer. And Kleinlehrer comes up elsewhere in the investigation because Kleinlehrer was part of or associated with the White Russian community in which Oswald integrated with. Kleinlehrer actually was a boyfriend for a time with Elena Hall, who actually gave the Oswalds a place to stay in 1962. And what Kleinlehrer says is, and I'd love for anybody, if anybody out there wants to contact me or you who works in the import-export business, especially if they worked in it in the 60s. Kleinlehrer's explanation to the FBI was this. I am a real import-export representative, and he was. And it's standard operating procedure for us when we go around Europe to make up fake import-export companies to throw off our competition. And so I made up this fake Texas Import-Export Company, and I gave it a fake address, and I had it on envelopes, and Oswald simply must have taken it from Elena Hall's home when I was her boyfriend and I was staying with her. Now, call me crazy, but it smells to me like a front. And of course, import-export companies were classic fronts for intelligence operations. But I don't know. Kleinlehrer is very interesting. I know of at least one person who is suspicious that Kleinlehrer himself was intelligence and that he was babysitting Oswald. And, the proof for that is not, super strong. But, one of the fascinating things is one of the White Russians said that when Oswald had still not yet settled in Dallas, right? So all that they knew from newspaper accounts was that he was coming to Dallas when he first got back from Russia. Kleinlehrer expressed open distrust of Oswald. Remember, they hadn't yet met him. Open distrust with Oswald about having the White Russian community have anything to do with Oswald. So there's your three angles. You've got the guy whose name is on the bottom of the library card, who turns out is a career criminal with some very serious mafia connections, including people who were involved in anti-Castro plots. You've got that guy's library card showing up with his friend at Moore Chevrolet, and another person who works at Moore Chevrolet is somebody who impersonated Oswald at least twice, possibly, and was actively involved in trying to raise weaponry, people, etc., for anti-Castro causes as late as 1964. Moore Chevrolet shows up on Oswald's map, and the person who actually had the library card at Moore Chevrolet for Grossi Bowen was trying to create a import-export company with Grossi Bowen that, if it was named the Texas Import-Export Company, happens to be the same name as the fake import-export company set up by a guy who Oswald stayed with when Oswald first came back from Russia. So add that all up, and you either got a bunch of rabbit holes, maybe some legitimate leads with one or two rabbit holes, or something that may be a huge key to trying to understand and unravel maybe what happened in this case.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's That's crazy, man. That's fascinating stuff. And one question that popped in my mind is, now when Oswald and this other guy Bowen were working at Jagger's Child Stovall, is this about the time that he ordered the rifle?
I actually have to really look that over. That's a very interesting point. That has to be delved into. That's probably when I get off the phone with you, that's probably the first thing I'm going to do is to check that out.
Yeah, I mean, because I know he ordered the rifles sometime around this time when I think it was when he was working there. I could be mistaken, but
Larry Hancock proposes the following thing, which is very interesting when you think about it in light of what you're just saying, which is, a military-based import-export, a military-based photography surveillance company is not the place where a career con man is going to set up shop. I mean, it's even risky in some sense because they're gonna you would expect them to do background checks, right? But Larry said, you know what a career con man needs? Fake identification.
Yeah.
And a photographic studio is exactly where you go for it. So Larry has proposed the possibility that maybe Grossi, who was under the fake name Bowen, was the person who would have maybe helped or showed Oswald how to make fake identification.
Yeah, for Heidel,
which would be
who ordered the gun,
which is what he would have used to get the gun.
Yeah.
So it does become a very interesting scenario. Now that you bring it up, and I'm going to have to definitely look into it.
Yeah, no doubt. And of course, another thing, I remember the Hoover memorandum that was going around, and I think it was 61 or 62, about somebody was using Oswald's, was it birth certificate or something?
Yeah, well, that was based off of the problems that were coming up dealing with Marguerite.
Yeah, with his mother.
It is fascinating, isn't it, though, that you have a memo from an FBI director in 1961 saying there might be somebody impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald who's going to 2 years later be accused of killing the president? I've always found that kind of nuts.
And you actually have people impersonating him,
Right, and
that we know of.
Well, the Bolton Ford incident is pretty solid. It's almost crazy how solid it actually is. The thing with Carney is a little bit questionable only because the name, Carney is remembering it 2 years after the fact. But the fact that both of them connect back up to this guy, Charles Waters, becomes incredibly interesting. And, of course, now Charles Waters becomes an incredibly interesting person to try and see, is he still alive? Is there more information on him? Is he worth an FBI FOIA? I'm sure he is. He becomes a very interesting figure, especially because by his own admission, he's super active in Dallas trying to work with anti-Castro groups to get them weapons and supplies. So a question that comes to mind is Charles Waters somebody who maybe, just throwing this out there, would have had something to do with people at the house in Harlandale Street? Which, for your audience, if they want to remember, is a building where a woman who turns out to be the mother of a Dallas cop says that she saw Lee Harvey Oswald go into this house. Now, that's, a debatable proposition. What isn't debatable is radical groups like Alpha 66 were working out of this house in the month before the assassination and suddenly upped and left town right after the assassination. And Waters is the kind of guy with access and hookups to guns and weapons and other exile groups. You got to think he's the kind of guy they'd hook up with.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I know a buddy of mine, he runs JFK Primary Sources. He's been digging a lot into William Dalzell. And, of course, I know Garrison thought he was CIA. Well, Garrison thought everybody was CIA, but I think he's still alive. And
Dalzell is still alive?
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Well, you're going to definitely have to hook me up with your friend, because I have a pretty good lead on who Joseph Moore was. Okay. And what was so fascinating about that grand jury testimony with Dalzell, and then I'll let you finish your thought. I'm sorry I interrupted.
Oh, you're fine.
But what's so fascinating about that grand jury is Dalzell plays completely dumb about Joseph Moore. And, Joseph Moore in some ways would be a more interesting find than Waters would be. But Dalzell is more than happy to throw Waters under the bus, but plays completely dumb about Moore. I have a pretty good lead as to who Moore is, and I think he's still alive. So maybe your friend and I can run down both of them and see what they're willing to say, because Waters now is incredibly interesting, and Moore is becoming incredibly interesting, has always been incredibly interesting.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I think he said the last that he could find on Dalzell is that he was living around in an old folks' home somewhere in the D.C. area. So
I will travel down to that old folks' home if he's still alive.
I'll meet you there.
No. Yeah, I'm only 3 or 4 hours away. I go down all the time to do document research. I will be happy to show up at William Dalzell's old folks' home and interview him.
Yeah, well, I'll get in touch with Will. His name's Will Hart. I'll get in touch with him and see if he can actually pin it down a little bit more. So we can actually find out where exactly this guy is, and yeah, for sure. Because he probably knows a little bit more than's been said through the years, and a lot of these guys just have never been tracked down and asked the right questions.
Yeah, I think I've got some right questions for them now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd love to show up. I don't know where Will lives, but if he wants to meet me down there, that sounds like a nice little research trip for the future.
Yeah, he's in Cleveland, I believe, or close to it.
All right, well, he got too long of a ride, but I'm happy to go down and if he can find me the home, I'll make the trip.
Yeah, well, I'll meet you there. I'm only an hour away, so.
Oh yeah, we got to get together then.
Yeah, for sure. Because like I said, I think we're seriously running out of time with a lot of these folks, man.
Absolutely, we've got 2 or 3 years max. I'm probably gonna call quote unquote Joseph Moore sometime in the next week, actually. Yeah.
Now, this guy Waters, he's no relation to Cecil. Well, no, that's Mick Waters.
Mick Waters.
Never mind. Yeah.
No, and the unfortunate thing with Waters is to have a name Charles Waters makes him a little bit more difficult to run down. But we do have a middle initial, approximate age.
Okay.
So we definitely have to run him down if he's still alive. He could very well still be alive. He would have been, like 27 and 63, I think. So you're dealing with a person who would be about 80 now.
Yeah, but getting up there and possibly in the range of could have passed away by now. Yeah.
Yeah, and all these folks could have family members who are worth, asking questions of.
Yeah, for sure. Because if they would tell anybody anything, it's going to be their son or daughter, or if they have anything they want to get off their chest before they go.
Absolutely.
Family is the big thing. And then of course, if it's something that they want to talk about, that's a whole nother issue. But that's a bridge to be crossed when we get there. But definitely, I will get in touch with Will and have him send you over what he's got on Dalzell.
Yeah. Dalzell is an interesting figure to me now.
A
bunch of those New Orleans groups. The group that it's a completely separate area of research, but the other group that's very interested in me out of New Orleans is the Committee to Free Cuba. Very interesting to me. And a gentleman by the name of Thomas Cuthbert Brady. And I haven't shared any of that research, but that's if I could find that guy, that could be a very interesting discussion too.
Yeah, well, you never know who's going to listen to this show, Stu. It goes all over the place, and all kinds of people hear it in Texas and Louisiana, and thousands of people listen. So if anybody out there has any information about anybody that we talked about here today, either get in touch with me or Stu Wexlar, and pass the information on, or let them know that we might be interested in wanting to talk to them. That would be great.
You can find me on Facebook, or you can email me at swexler2, like my first initial last name, the number 2, swexler2 @hotmail.com.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you never know what'll shake loose.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of where we have to be now. We got to hope that people have little pieces of the puzzle. I can tell you, just as an interesting side story, and I have to try and recontact him and find his contact information. After I had talked to people about Licavoli, and I'm only going to give a broad outline of this story because I don't know how much this person wants me to share. I went into the hall and talked with somebody who knew somebody. Well, it was secondhand. He went to high school with someone who was in the Cleveland mob under Licavoli's control. Who was the son of somebody who was in the Cleveland mob under Licavoli's control, who had moved down to Texas. And this guy had, he didn't have any interaction with the son, or really the sons, but he knew a professor who knew the sons. And that professor had said that one of the sons had a very interesting story related to the father and Jack Ruby and maps on his floor in Dallas, and definitely something that could potentially connect Licavoli to the crime. Licavoli also connects very closely to a guy named Dominique Bartone. And the person who I was looking for was talk about before was Mo Dallas. So Mo Dallas is a Cleveland mobster who was very close to Licavoli and the Mayfield Road mob. And Dallas, is very close with Roselli. They run Vegas casinos together. So, I mean, there's ways where these things all can tie up into mafia CIA plots. But, again, there's three angles to this. Again, if any of the viewers out there, or listeners, I should say, were in the import-export business in the 1960s, I would love to know if there's a story that Kleinlehrer told that it was standard operating procedure to make up fake names and fake import-export businesses to throw off your competition. I would love to know if that's true.
Yeah, well, what pops in my head, Stu, is, of course, George from Seinfeld and his Vandelay Industries.
Yeah, maybe this guy did business with George, and George is connected to the Kennedy assassination, the magic spitter.
Yeah, the magic loogie.
Yeah.
Now that's full circle, baby. That's what we got.
I think we just solved the Kennedy assassination.
Yep, hell yeah. Now, man, good stuff. And, of course, Will, like I said, he's from Cleveland, so he might know a little bit more about Licavoli and these guys, too.
Yeah, you definitely have to hook me up with Will, because the Licavoli mob and the Mayfield Road mob may wind up being a more significant factor here than we realized.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, man, that's fascinating stuff, Stu. Really, I mean, stuff that wasn't even on my radar. But, one thing I've been thinking about lately is, of course, about the rifle. And I always thought it possible that since it was ordered under this alias, and since Oswald had, of course, false identification for this alias, and he was handing out these flyers for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee under this alias, or this alias was a secretary, or whatever the deal was there. But that this gun could be tied back to Alec Heidel. Okay, that's who ordered the gun. That there was, maybe it was meant to be, this fictitious pro-Castro fictional character that took the rap for the Kennedy assassination, and maybe Oswald was just facilitating, actually getting the weapon into the building, but it was actually somebody else who was shooting from a different location, and maybe Oswald didn't think that it could ever be tied back to him.
That would be my favorite theory, actually. If I were to, it's speculative, but I tend to go with Oswald bringing the right weapon into the building and the likelihood that somebody else maybe fired the shot. it's super tricky, of course, because, as Jerry Dealey points out, it would be pretty hard to navigate around the school book depository as a stranger without somebody noticing you.
Right.
But on the flip, again, I mean, I will tell you this, I didn't even realize it until I started talking to somebody about my presentation, and it caught them. You remember the name of the friend who had the library card at the Moore Chevrolet?
Yeah, Riddell.
Riddell.
Yeah.
So, again, I think it's probably a reach, but
hey, anything's possible.
It is interesting. And I do, by the way, have somebody who's working with me on some of those angles too. I think if we pulled forces, we might be able to maybe develop this into something pretty intense.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, and I'll get a hold of Will, and we'll get to cracking on some of this stuff, see if we can't shake some stuff loose and uncover even more, for sure.
Yep.
All right, Stu. Well, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show today and talking with me, and hopefully we enlighten some folks out there. I know you enlightened me. So thank you very much for coming on the show. Okay.
It was great being on. You have a good one.
All right, you hang on the line for me, Stu. Everybody, for some other stuff we talked about here today, I'm going to put links up, some photos over at tlgpodcast.com. Always, as that's the place to go to for more about what we talked about here. That's it, people. This sumbitch is in the can, beamed up the satellite down directly to your ears, people. This is your boy. Peace.